This video explains how I built a deer stand on top of an old wood grain wagon. The wagon cost, practically nothing. It was sitting in trees and it had been unprotected for over 20 plus years, and it was quite warped. So there's a number of things that had to be done to bring it back to make it so it wouldn't, fall over once you put the deer stand on it. It's good to start out with a wagon that's steel, so you don't have to worry about the rotten wood and the lack of stability. So check it out before you get it. You may have to reinforce the bed like I did. Try to start with as good a wagon as you possibly can. But the advantages of a wagon is you can move this deer stand anywhere you want. And it sits high enough off the ground that you have a little better viewpoint. Not as good as you would if you were in a tree, but a wagon is an excellent option for building a deer stand. If you're going to create a deer blind and try to build a deer blind in an old wagon, you're going to need a truck. And most of the materials that I bought were used or salvage material called dunnage, dunnage with a D. And these 3/4 inch pieces of oriented strand board weighed about 70 pounds a piece because they were out in a lumber yard soaking wet. I paid $5 a piece for the lumber. Whether I bought it used at an estate sale or at the lumber yard, most of the wood was scrapped or salvaged from somewhere else, so I had practically no cost into the wood. But to get it there was quite a chore because there's a lot of weight in it. And if you buy wet OSB, you need to make sure that you get it transported and nailed into place quick before it starts to warp. The first thing I did was to set up a workstation. I used pieces of plywood to put the tools on so they didn't get lost in the grass, and also to set up a couple of sawhorses. Have a good workstation so you can find your tools back and you don't have to fight for them. And the plywood that you're using is as good as anything to set up and work off of. You'll have plenty of extra pieces till you get to the roof. I ended up with 3 extra sheets of plywood, so it was just fine using one for a sawhorse and the other one on the ground. Undoubtedly, the most useful tools I had was a framing nailer and a staple gun and my tape measure. I mean, one was in my hand at all times when making this deer stand. And I bought these used, and not for a lot of money. I think I had a 5,000 staples and the staple nailer for $40, and I think I paid 10 or $20 for the framing nailer with some nails. Very useful tools and almost indispensable if you're going to put together a lot of plywood on something like this. Best to use galvanized nails, something exterior grade. If you're going to use dunnage or used lumber that's wet, you want something that won't rust out because of the moisture inside the wood. Half the wood I had was soaking wet, so I put a lot of staples into it to try to hold it together. Set your wagon on as level of ground as you possibly can. Inspect the wagon to find out whether the bed is true. Most of them are going to have a warped bed unless you get a steel wagon. Check the tires, check the undercarriage, just to see what kind of problems you have, and then plan your deer stand in advance. Think about it for a couple of weeks before you start putting nails or screws in. It'll save you a lot of time. The first thing I needed to do was take the end gate out. Don't take out too many bolts. Some of those bolts and the holes and the fittings could be very useful, as you'll see in later slides. Only remove what you have to. I had to remove the end of it because I had to have a place for a door. Otherwise, I would have tried to keep the end gate in. It adds integrity. Here's a good example of why you don't want to dismantle the entire wagon. There was a perfectly solid piece of metal in which you can hook a chain into to provide stability. So you have to chain these things to some kind of post so that they don't blow over. The wagon ended up being, I think, 11 feet tall, so it needs to be staked down for heavy winds. One of the first things to think about is providing integrity to that bed. This bed had a warp that was probably 2 to 3 inches on each side. That is, both sides, both right and left, was lower than the middle. So what I did is I put in sheets of OSB on that bed. I did not immediately staple it down because there was still moisture in the bed, and I wanted to give it time to leach out. But I wanted that wood to use as a platform, a base for the walls. So I did cover the bed, clean it with a broom, cover it, and then later on I put probably 500 staples into that plywood into the bed in order to provide greater structural integrity to the bed, just in case it was rotten in certain spots, then the extra wood would hold it together. As you start framing, it's very important to have a couple of ladders, not just one, and to cut your sheets of plywood to length before you put them in. I did a slope or a pitched roof on this. You don't need to do that if you use membrane. I did end up picking up a piece of rubber membrane that fit over the top, and so I could have done a flat roof, would have been a lot easier and a lot less cracks in it. Nevertheless, you just have to start with one piece and you just work your way around until you get to the back. I waited to install a door until the very end. One of the things you need to think about as you go along when using this old or used lumber is how you're gonna fill up these cracks. And I use 2x4s to provide structural integrity on each corner, as well as, fill up the gap because you have a crooked bed that you're building on. But you can see there that there's a crack between the two pieces of wood. I used, part of that when I put in windows, but, the spray foam insulation that you can get for homes, one little can goes a long way, and it filled up almost every crack I had. I used probably 6 or 8, maybe even 10 tubes of caulk to fill up every line and try to prevent air infiltration, and it worked quite well. And I bought most of that stuff at moving sales and rummage sales, and for just practically nothing. So it really didn't cost me that much to have a lot of cracks. Before you start your project, one of the things to think about is to keep the water off of it once you get it started. And I bought a huge tarp. I actually had to buy something new for this one. And then tied it down with twine string to all the different tie down points to keep it there. Initially, I was going to simply use Thompson's water seal to seal up the roof and caulk between the two seams, but I eventually found some membrane roofing, and that is certainly a preferred method to find something solid. Use steel, membrane roofing, whatever you can find that provides a complete seal on it rather than shingles. It's pretty hard to get a pitch that's good enough to use regular shingles. Make a decision early on whether you want to frame it up 16 inches off center. Obviously, below the windows, you're not going to be able to do it. I tried to keep it 16 inches off center because I knew I'd find rolls of insulation for practically nothing, and I could put a little insulation in. Plus, I wanted that extra integrity that would help provide stability for the wagon bed, which was quite weak. When I cut the windows, I tried to cut them right next to a seam where two pieces of plywood went together because I always had a 1/4 inch space in there. Now, a lot of people like to use a piece of plexiglass for windows. Just put it in and put it on something that will slide back and forth. Plexiglass is expensive, and if you use this sliding method, it provides a space for a lot of air infiltration. I found tons of used windows that I could use. The problem is they're too large. I got lucky. I found a contractor that went out of business and had a bunch of salesman samples. 2 of them already were framed up, which was a good thing. So you had something to nail into. The third one I had to kind of rig up a frame around it to be able to make it work. Cutting the holes in, I was very inaccurate, and I had to do a lot of woodwork to try to fill up the holes because I didn't cut the holes accurate. If there's anything you do that to practice good woodworking is measure those windows and cut the holes as close to size as possible and figure out how you're going to set them in there. As best you can. You want a good solid window. These windows were vertical windows. I laid them on their sides, and then I drilled little holes in them so those slides on the bottom could drain water out. However, I had overhangs on this roof that was probably 12 inches all the way around, which protected a lot against moisture infiltration. It still took a tube of caulk around each one to try to fill up most of the holes. But by all means, find something. These cost $5 a piece, so it was just no cost at all, and there's plenty of used materials out there. Whether you use storm windows or salesman samples, there's plenty of free material out there. Whatever you do, try to think ahead. And one of the problems with having real windows, especially ones you put horizontal instead of vertical, is water coming off the wall and running down into the windows, freezing in the tracks. And I want to minimize that as much as possible. So I found I had some old floorboards out of an old barn, and I simply took them in and they had tongue and groove. So I put the groove side up and then caulked into it so water coming off that wall would catch those grooves and then pitch out to the right and left side of the window. And then I put a lot of caulk in on the outside to try to prevent it. But you know, the advantage is I have a window that slides, and it provides a little bit larger view when you put it horizontally. There's some problems with it. Make your choice on it. You can't get them too big, then you can't put your 2x4s in to provide the integrity on the walls. Without a doubt, you need to have tie downs on all four corners. I didn't want to use just regular bolts and washers for fear they'd work their way through plywood. Some of the plywood was 1/2 inch, some of it was 3/4. And you have lots of pieces of scrap, so why not use that scrap for something? I found short pieces of 2x4 very useful, and I just use it as a washer to provide some structural integrity here. And I had, since these bolts were long, I could move them in and out and help tighten up my chain. At the same time, you could use some construction adhesive and glue these things to the wall if you really wanted to make them permanent. But I put 4, 1 on each corner. I was able to scavenge more chain than I could ever use, but one of the things I liked best was these little clip hooks on it, so that you can adjust the chain depending on how far you're going to put your post out, whether you make a mistake or not. Anything you can do to make that chain a little bit adjustable, even taking a bolt and then fastening a bolt in for it, makes things faster, because the whole objective of this deer blind is you can hook it behind a truck or a tractor and move it to another place when you're tired of hunting in that one spot. Here you can see that I used extra wood to create shelves above the window. I also took cedar trees and cut some limbs off and stapled them into the 2x4s that framed up the window. And you know, it's nice to have a place to put your gun and put ammo and gloves and anything else. So any chance I had to put an extra shelf or make coat hooks out of some kind of wood material, and the cedar tree will last 1,000 years. And it was fast. You just take a staple gun and pop it in. I cut that wood using a draw saw, which I found very useful around the project. I hate using regular hand-powered tools, but the draw saw was really great when you went out trying to cut scraps of wood. All I'm trying to illustrate here is the problems that you have when you're not a good carpenter. You can see there's a 1/2 inch space below that window where it was set. And you know, I found ingenious ways to try to do it. Not really genius ways, just ingenious. But you know, you have a lot of scrap wood. Use your scrap wood. In the photo on the right, you can see where I filled up an entire line using an end piece from a piece of OSB that was going to get thrown away. So I covered up the space, and then on the inside I caulked it to give it a greater seal. The part on the left, I think I put an extra piece of wood in underneath, and then I used spray foam insulation. And as I said before, those little cans, they really go a long way. And take advantage of even if you got to buy one new. I bought mine for 25 cents at a rummage sale. The last part to install was the door. I did put a spring on that door in case it gets pulled open too fast by the wind, it won't get broke off. This door was salvaged from an old house that was ready to get burned. I'm not so sure I would use a heavy wood door like this. This door weighed probably 75 pounds. It was real solid wood, but it was nice because I had it was already framed up, and I was able to staple the frame into it. I think you might be better off using a storm door or something like that. They're easy to find. But just make sure you have one wide enough. One of my goals on this was to make this wheelchair accessible, and I do have a door that's big enough. Now, the problem with putting the door in here is getting a good seal. That bed was so heavily bowed, I had to go in and cut that door on a slight angle, and still had to shim up some wood on the side so that I could keep mice and stuff from getting in underneath the door. You can see that there is a pitch on that roof and quite a bit of an overhang. You don't necessarily need that overhang. I wanted it because I felt that it would keep water off the windows. Now, most people don't put stain or paint on their deer stand. but I found some so cheap that I couldn't resist it. So I luckily I had a very good professional grade or near professional grade power washer, and I power washed everything inside and out because the wood I used was filthy. And I think it made paint stick a lot better. Actually, I used a stain. So I'd suggest if you're going to put on a coat of paint and you're using used materials like I did, get yourself a pressure washer and give it a good cleaning. Give it a week or so to dry out before you put your stain on. When you're going to apply stain, I started out using a roller. It just got too tedious, so I powered up airless and sprayed it in. I used a pantyhose to strain the stain because it had been sitting in a garage for a long time and it needed to be stirred. And you got to strain the material that solidified out of it so it doesn't plug up your sprayer. And it took more time to set the sprayer up than it did to spray. I took about 2 gallons of a good quality oil-based stain to do this. And then after that, I used Thompson's water seal after it dried for probably a month. And then just used a garden sprayer and sprayed it with Thompson's water seal. One thing you should do on the interior of your wagon is put in some type of a rug. I had some pieces of AstroTurf that a couple of pieces, so I could lay that down. It makes it quieter to walk around, and at the end of the year you can pull it out and shake it out. And AstroTurf, you could even take a power washer and just put it over a line and power wash it to try to keep some of the dirt from building up in the inside. Here you have the finished product. I took a set of horns and put over the front. This is the actual front end of the wagon where the tongue's at. You can see around the wagon because the wood was set inside of the wagon walls. I had space where water could come in and infiltrate, and so I took the extra membrane roofing that I attached and I put it around the edge and made a drip edge over the top of that wagon to keep water from going down into the bed and then underneath your floorboards. I guess you didn't have to do it because they do have a good overhang, but anything you can do to keep water from getting into that bed and getting underneath it to cause rot is a good thing. The second thing is you can see I put a set of deer horns on it. And I know that everybody watching this probably has a bunch of horns hanging in a garage or a barn. You might as well use them for something. They're just going to sit there. And I'm going to decorate this thing with every set of horns I can find, neighbors, cousin, anybody. I think I'll just cover it. This is the finished product. This is what it looked like when it was done after stain, after Thompson's water seal, and getting ready to be pulled to a pasture 8 miles away and set up ready for deer season. You can see at the very top, you can see I put nails around the edge. I used regular nails to nail that membrane roofing in and then stapled the roofing underneath to put a little drip edge as water comes off. And I'm very careful to keep the water off. The membrane roofing that it covers the sides of the wagon walls, I just used a stapler and stapled that up and then took some caulk and caulked any space that I could get that needed a little bit more filled so it would shed water. Good luck in your project.